What do we say in response to the Green Paper, and also how do we organise in response to the Green Paper? The Convention, as a group, is a very loose organising committee. It's an ad hoc committee. It has no official weight, but it has we have done this on the basis, essentially, of saying what we want to do is find the greatest unity. We're not proposing to set up a rival organisation to any existing organisation. But we do think that we're going to need to strengthen the organisation that comes out of this conference to do something very important, which is to take this conference and apply it in your institution. Apply it in your community. Apply it to people that you know and you organise with, academic groupings and so on, to have a debate about the Green Paper and have a debate about what we do about it. Because the government is quite determined to push this through. UCU, I was at a UCU meeting, national meeting yesterday. We were told that conversations with Joe Johnson and so on, this person is not for turning. He wants to get a higher education bill in the next parliamentary session in which he will legislate to allow the changes that are proposed in the Green Paper. It is right to say that the Green Paper is written backwards from its conclusions and the justifications are constructed around the conclusions. Crucially, the government is not prepared at this point in time to back down from its conclusions. But they don't have, I would argue, they don't have a political base to carry them through if we oppose them and if we build the biggest possible movement. And that's why the final point I want to make is that we can win. We can win by uniting the sector against this government proposal. We can win by uniting people in favour of a positive view of higher education as what we fight to defend it. That every single member of our colleagues who dedicate their life to teaching and researching in universities have got a stake in this argument. And that's what we should always remember. Because they're under threat. They're in the sights of this government. Thanks.
I'm assuming you all know how the TEF would work. 5-yearly disciplinary panels reviewing quantitative and qualitative evidence leading to award of TEF levels, 5 different TEF levels, and a potential uplift of fees in line with inflation. The crucial thing to point out here is that fees can only vary within this extremely narrow band. So the current £9,000 level plus inflation, and the 4 levels of TEF would have to be within that band. And currently inflation is 0.1%. So the crucial take-home point from this is that there are no extra resources coming for teaching. The Green Paper talks about extra resources, but in fact there are no extra resources. The unit of resource at best stagnates, the amount of resources we have per student. So there are some colleagues, unfortunately, who are rather naive on this point. I've heard lots of people say at various meetings, oh, this is a chance to really revalue teaching and tilt the balance away from research towards teaching and value teaching. Now, it would be wonderful if that was the case. It's not the case. There are no extra resources, and there's no let-up in the pressure around research either. So that's one thing to disabuse people of, that it's about extra resources for teaching. The other thing to point out to staff is the way that this is going to be governed. How is teaching going to be measured? Through crude and imperfect proxies that the government itself admits are rubbish. Things that have nothing to do with teaching, like employability, for example, or retention, or NSS schools. These things have only the most faint connection with quality of teaching. For example, it's frequently shown that students' feedback is better when students learn less, because they prefer easier assessment. So actually it would decrease the quality of teaching. How it will be governed is very much like the REF, with these 5-yearly reviews by these panels. It will quickly become a bureaucratic monstrosity. We're already spending £1.1 billion a year, which is 8% of the teaching budget, on quality assurance. And universities will be required to absorb the costs of the TEF, just like they absorb most of the costs of the REF, which was over £230 million last time round. So this is not about value for money, and it's not about improving choice for students. It's about increasing the number of bureaucrats, middle managers and so on. This is a way to build support from staff, because we already know what a nightmare the REF is in our institutions, and the way that it's used coercively by management, and the way that it distracts us from research. The TEF will be the same. And we could also say to students, do you want your £9,000 fees to be used to pay for gigantic bureaucratic exercises? Do you know that 8% of the teaching budget is already wasted away on these bureaucratic exercises? That's not about value for money. It'll actually detract from the number of staff we can employ to teach you. We can also build links with management. One of the reasons why there have been so many critical responses is that, going back to the point about the uplift in fees, if you get a maximum uplift of 0.1%, that's not really even going to cover your costs of this gigantic exercise. You'd have to be a complete idiot to sign up to this scheme. Now, many vice-chancellors may well be complete idiots, but we have to start from the perspective that they don't necessarily want to shoot themselves in the face. So this is where there is a possibility of building links with management. Often we find ourselves on opposing sides over HE governance, but this is one where institutions should have no interest in signing up to the TEF. The UCL provost, for example, has said, we probably won't sign up for financial reasons. It wouldn't make any sense. Other institutions have been much more naive. So London Met, for example, somehow thinks this will benefit them. It won't. It's actually part of a campaign, I think, to force the market to shut down London Met, for example. So there are possibilities of appealing to the basic self-interest of governing bodies. We can also appeal to students in terms of thinking about and exposing the negative changes that the TEF will bring about in the way that we educate students. We all know that when we metricise something, behaviour is changed to face the metrics. That is the whole point of metricising things. It's meant to drive behavioural change. And what kind of changes are going to be driven by the TEF? It's not going to lead to any more resources being allocated towards teaching, because as I've said, there are no more resources. A league table just came out about the top 100 universities for staff-student ratios in the world. Not one UK institution was on that list. So we're already in a situation where we don't have enough staff to provide the highest quality education that we might like for our students. My seminar groups this year are 25 in size. They're larger in some institutions and courses. So this is a situation which is already not good and is going to be made worse. We're going to have to be teaching to the test, particularly if the pilot studies on learning gain, which some turncoat institutions are participating in, come out, and we go down that route for measuring teaching excellence. We will be teaching to the learning gain test. Equally, if we have to try and drive up student satisfaction ratings, we may be compelled to give in to certain student demands, for example around more contact hours, which are actually detrimental to students' education. So yes, students often want more contact hours, but that's often driven by a demand for spoon feeding, and it will take away from the essential private study time which is required for true higher learning. So it's important to be able to resist those demands, because actually as educators we know what is better for the students than they may do themselves, but we will be compelled to do that. So if we want spoon feeding and teaching to the test, which is exactly what has happened in the secondary school system, is now widely recognised, then we should go down the TEF route. If we don't, then we need to resist it, and we need to appeal to students and say, this is a different educational system. We need to explain the rationale behind it. We need to explain how the TEF will damage their education and will lead to the gaming of these systems that actually undermine the value of their degrees. And finally, there's a point about social mobility, and this is another area where I think there's a certain level of naivety among some university staff. Well, at least the government's talking about social mobility, and a lot of universities are. But there's nothing in the TEF that will actually address social mobility. They talk about it a lot, and they talk about disaggregating the data according to social mobility, but there's no discussion about how to assist social mobility through institutions. How will breaking down the data help? There's no suggestion about extra subsidies to institutions that take a lot of students from non-traditional backgrounds, some kind of handicap in the TEF. actually the institutions that take students from non-traditional backgrounds will suffer in the TEF, because as the Green Paper itself admits, students from those backgrounds tend to do less well. And since there's no handicap and no extra money for those students, it will actually expose those institutions as somehow failing. Those institutions that take the most students from non-traditional backgrounds are being set up to fail. And that is, again, something that we can build links with colleagues who care about social mobility, and we can build links with students who also have an interest in that. So I think this is where we need to focus. It's on exposing the holes, the limitations, the negative byproducts of these for our institutions, for our working conditions, and for our students. Thanks.
This is the first event that I've been to which has begun with a poem, which I very much enjoyed. But I think by the time I've finished, you might feel that a prayer is more appropriate. I'd also like to refer to a review in the New York Review of Books some years ago, talking about the phenomenon of Sarah Palin, saying that the amazing thing about American politics was that just as the craziest possible thing you thought could happen had happened, then along came something even crazier. I'd like, since I composed my few remarks for today, which the full paper I hope will be on the website somewhere, I happened to read the Department of Business and Information Skills plan to 2020. I quote, "BIS is strengthening English higher education, ensuring the system remains financially sustainable, allows new entrants to the market, and is open to people from all backgrounds. Through the Teaching Excellence Framework, we'll help to ensure students benefit from high quality teaching." Well, the one thing I want to talk about today is how, had anyone in BIS been interested in any of the scholarly literature on markets in higher education, they would have realised that something like the TEF is actually guaranteed to lower quality of teaching and quality of student experience rather than raise it, and that's the point I want to simply talk about today. The reason for this is that once you start to organise things on market-based lines, information becomes of crucial importance. When economists talk about attempts to place the provision of public services on market lines, they usually talk about things like externalities and various things of that kind. But my work on markets in higher education shows that the really crucial issue is information. Now, in the conventional economics literature, market failures due to information are usually due to something called information asymmetry, where one party to a transaction has information that the other doesn't. And in fact, Joseph Stiglitz got his Nobel Prize on the strength of that work. But in higher education, the problem is much more fundamental. The problem in higher education is that nobody has the information that enables them to make the kinds of judgments that are envisaged in, for example, the Green Paper. It's like William Goldman said, famous Hollywood screenwriter, in Hollywood, nobody knows anything, and that has to be the starting point. However, given the fact that there are not any secure, reliable, valid measures of teaching quality that can be used to discriminate between subjects, programs, or institutions, but given also the preference to organise higher education on market-based lines with full cost fees, ease of market entry and all the rest of it, naturally people using the system seek proxies. And in higher education, the proxy they seek is prestige. And therefore, once you have a market system in higher education, you are inevitably going to have a more stratified system. And the evidence for that can be found in many, many places. For example, just recently, it's clear that the main beneficiaries of the final removal of student recruitment numbers have been the more prestigious universities. And as we all know, to some extent anyway, that stratification is essentially social. There are many other consequences of marketisation that I haven't got time to deal with today. Diversion of resources away from teaching, rationalisation of institutions, rationalisation of subjects, etc. But let me turn finally to this question of quality. Now, the Green Paper, clearly irony is not a commodity in heavy supply within BIS, because on page 26 it refers to a Higher Education Academy report that nearly half of the institutions had changed their degree algorithms to ensure that their students were not disadvantaged compared to those in other institutions. So the Green Paper professes to be worried about grade inflation. There is no recognition that one of the main causes of that grade inflation is the very increasing competition that the government has introduced and which it now wishes to intensify. And there are other issues about quality. For example, quality is seen primarily in economic criteria. Higher education itself is commodified. And as we know, within institutions, quality assurance shifts away from quality enhancement to reputation management. And I've written about this at length elsewhere. But undoubtedly, the biggest threat to quality, and it's already been referred to by the previous speaker, is just the amount of resource that complying with the TEF is actually going to involve. A quote was given, a figure was given for the REF of 230 million. I have actually seen estimates going up to 1 billion. I don't want to be scaremongering, but if you think the REF does cost 200 million, what on earth is the TEF going to cost if everybody jumps into it, etc.? I can't go into more detail, there isn't really time. I'd just like to end, if you like, with a sort of public plea. I am, as you may know, a former Vice-Chancellor. I don't know whether it's right to draw historical parallels between our Vice-Chancellors and either Hitler's generals or Mrs. Thatcher's permanent secretaries. But I think this is the one final opportunity for the Vice-Chancellors to show that they're not simply interested in their salaries and their bonuses, etc., and their cars, and actually show solidarity with the rest of the sector. As the previous speaker has said, they don't actually need the money. The fact is our unit of resource, our fee, remains the highest in the world outside the American private institutions. And with inflation pretty well negative, they won't get much of an uplift anyway. It's obvious, or should be obvious to anyone, that the costs for individual institutions of attempting to comply with whatever comes out of the TEF exercise are going to be monstrous. And this is, I think, an opportunity for the Vice-Chancellor simply to say, we won't take part. And I think they should also discourage their staff from being nominated to assessment panels and things of that kind. Final point. What I think is the saddest aspect of the Green Paper is that if you followed anything I've written about quality assurance in UK higher education for about 20 years, you'll know that I think there are issues that the sector has to understand, has to try to make sense of. Comparability of degree standards is definitely still an issue. The question of the relationship between research and teaching is an issue in many places. We all know that, and there are other issues as well. The question is whether the Green Paper helps us to tackle some of those issues or takes us further away. And undoubtedly, I think it's further away. I'd just like to end, if I may, John, with a joke, another joke. If anyone has read Robert Skidelsky's biography of John Maynard Keynes, they may know the story that in the First World War, Keynes was part of a team of Allied officials who were negotiating what reparations Germany would have to make if she lost the First World War. And the American attitude was very, very hardline and was driving Keynes bonkers. And Keynes communicated with his chum Smuts, who was the foreign minister of South Africa, by telegrams, as was usual in those days. Keynes described the situation to Smuts, and Smuts said, it reminds me of the old Jewish joke, he said, where the devout Jew prays to God and says, God, this is a real crisis, don't send your son, come yourself. My first piece of advice would simply be to email your Vice-Chancellor and ask him or her, you know, what his attitude towards the framework is, you know, what his plans are, and ask him in particular whether he's made any assessment of the potential benefits and costs to the institution. And that ought to elicit some sort of response and ought to be the basis for some sort of conversation. And I doubt whether there are many Vice-Chancellors who are able to show that participating in the framework is going to be more beneficial than not. The problem, of course, is that the Vice-Chancellors are, to some extent, like a gathering swine. When the National Student Surveys were started, for example, Oxford, Cambridge and a few other institutions decided not to take part, and then gradually they came in. So I think there's little that individual Vice-Chancellors can do, but if everybody in this room who's employed in a university simply sent their Vice-Chancellor a very straightforward email of the kind I described, that in itself I think would help considerably.
On the point about staff disengagement and so on, I mean, I think your characterisation of academic disengagement from these questions is correct, and it's very dispiriting for those of us who want a more activist academy. These things we wouldn't be in this situation if there'd been more resistance over the last 20 years. But we are where we are, and I think Sean's right to have started the day on a note of optimism that we can win. There is very limited political basis for this. So if there's just a bit of resistance, we can deflect at least some of its worst aspects. But that does involve challenging your colleagues to be more resistant and to actually stand up against these things and to challenge some of these passivities. There's no other way around it. It is dispiriting and depressing, but we have to start from a position that this is a small group of people pushing an ideological agenda that has no real popular mandate. So the more forces you can unite and mobilise against it, the greater chance you have of deflecting it. As for the student point, I mean, I take your point that I don't want to march up to a student and say, I know best, listen to me. But the bottom line is you contradicted yourself and saying, well, we know a lot about pedagogy. That's the point. That's why you're an educator and they're a student. And I don't ever want to get away from that fundamental point. It's not always the case that students know what's best for them. This is, if we buy into that idea that they do know best, you're buying into the consumerist mentality that the government wants to encourage around students, that student choice should be at the heart of everything. The reality is they don't. Students always come towards a university in a supplicant position, right? That's just the nature of the situation. They come to learn. And I think having some sense of authority, that we've got something worth imparting to them, is essential to the educational process. So certainly the tone and the way that you approach students has to be sensitive to the fact that they also bring something to the table. Of course they do. But in the end, we shouldn't just give away the fact that we have something greater to offer. That's why they're coming to us for an education. That's just my view on the educational process.
Okay, take another round of questions.
It's not the case that the higher education sector has sat back and allowed the government to come out with its proposals without a response. Quite an extraordinary level of activity has taken place within the universities, but often it's through official bodies. 600 responses have been submitted to the Green Paper. Quite more than in 2010 and more than in 2011. Most of the responses that we've seen have been very critical, particularly in relation to the TEF, but not just in relation to the TEF. Huge amount of criticism of what's being proposed, and with good reason, we would say. But that, it seems to me, creates both an opportunity and a risk for us. The opportunity is that we can push with the mainstream and build a really big movement to defend higher education. That we can isolate those people who want to project this new model of private providers and of introducing more competition into the sector through allowing corporations to set themselves up as universities as fast as their little legs can carry them. That we can isolate those people politically within the government. It's not true, for example, that they carry a lot of necessarily universal weight even within the Conservative Party, and it's certainly true that beyond the ranks of the Conservative Party there will be very large numbers of MPs and Lords who would be opposed to this. And it's not surprising that therefore that when you see the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge write a scathing criticism of the TEF and the Green Paper, that you realise that something is different about this. But there are also threats and risks. It's not true that everybody is united in the sector about what the solutions are. So whilst we might be opposed to the Green Paper, it's not true that everybody has a common agreement about how do we address, for example, the question of social mobility, which the government raises.
Somebody asked, how do we have an impact on the people who run higher education institutions, the principals, vice-chancellors and whoever? And just from a bit of experience, I'd say 2 routes. One is, if there's a union branch in your institution, that branch, and it happened in the case of my branch, simply asked to go and talk to our registrar and vice-chancellor while they were writing their response to the Green Paper, and he said, what we said was, we know you've got your agenda, we've got ours, but we think there might be some common ground. And I went and spent an hour and a half having a conversation, which then fed into my university's response, because I saw it. Some things we didn't have an impact, some things we did. The other was we had a debate at Senate, or the other governing bodies, where you can get into the open. And that means you start having a conversation not only with your university management, but with your colleagues. I agree that colleagues are either frightened or very much locked into their own things. I think positively there are areas that they care about, including actually quite often teaching. And I think myself, if you go through people's commitment to their subject and their department, you very often can have the conversations about, if this comes in, you will not be able to do the things you take pride in doing and doing well. And I'm throwing these things out as my views, not as truths, because I'd be interested to hear other people's response. On the student thing, I think it's about saying we work together. I think it's about saying you as students have needs and wants which we are helping to meet because we have our various kinds of expertise and enthusiasm for the fields in which we work. And incidentally, that's often true for non-academic staff as well as it is for academic staff. I happen to be speaking as an academic. And then you can get into some of the things we as academics do in the courses we design or the programs we offer are ones that you might want to grumble about, but we do have our reasons, but you have that discussion as part of the conversation. So I think it's not so much a question of are you a pessimist, are you an optimist? I think I'm a bit of both, but I think it is a question of finding the ways and means and places where you can be active and communicate, and in some cases listen. So, I mean, and I'm just wondering if that perspective makes sense to anyone else in the room. I mean, I don't know how isolated I would be in setting those views out.
Thank you. There's one more question there. Yeah.
Me. Yeah. Just to enlarge on the student questions, I think it's not just about tone, it's also the fact that for a lot of students, in particular disciplines, they don't necessarily understand this very clearly. So I'm wondering, is there a kind of simpler way that we could put this across to students so they understand what we're saying? And also that, I mean, I'm from London Met, so obviously we have a particular problem at London Met with this, but I've had students say to me quite often, I'm paying, I don't want to learn that. So this is a very kind of marketised university. Do you have suggestions for how you respond to that?
Liverpool University, along with the other Russell Group's university, recently submitted as part of the Green Paper, and all the Green Paper submissions of the universities are online by now. Now, they don't want to be they don't want to be subject to FOII requirements, freedom of information requirements anymore. Now, this might be just some mad administrators not wanting to have to deal with all these questions, but I have to say that this is a bit more than that. I think part of what the universities are seeing right now with the changes with the Green Paper is that they're moving much more towards a private sector situation as opposed to being a public sector. They don't think that this requires them to actually abide by such requests, which makes their business ventures subject to freedom of information. Now, the reason I'm putting that down is because I think that, okay, we might have some vice-chancellors there that are nice guys and they don't like that particular Green Paper that much. But I think the promotion of the business model within the university is one that actually precludes strategically them being against the Green Paper. And that is also shown by the measures that are being taken at the same time with the Green Paper. So, for example, and I'm taking Liverpool as an example, but I'm sure we're going to find other things similar in other places. We have, in the same Senate that the Green Paper was discussed, or rather the response to the Green Paper was discussed, they brought in KPIs with a very interesting matrix, which on the one side has teaching, the TEF, on the other side has the REF, and we are supposed to put our institutions in relation to this matrix, and our target is to move everyone in the top quarter of the matrix. That's going to be reflected on personal performance management, that's going to be reflected on departmental performance management, and that is also going to be reflected on promotions and on probations. On top of that, we appoint level 2 permanent heads with external advertising. Hey, what are we exactly? And I'm sure that the same kind of prospects are going to apply, and business models are going to be applied in other higher education institutions too. So I honestly, with the exception of some romantics, don't think that our alliance with university management is one that's going to move forward. They're going to try and find, if the green paper doesn't work on that, other ways of actually performance managing us and actually running a business model with more or less a private, not the privatization system. It's not going to be a privatized university. They're not going to sell it to anyone. They are the private sector. So I think the main hazard we have is not getting the new licenses to the new providers, is that we have to look back and realize that we are private.
Yeah, very briefly. Talking to the students, there's getting to be quite a lot of evidence now that the students tend to fall into sort of 3 camps. There are undoubtedly those who see themselves essentially as consumers, and as you say, they want to be told, just as they are in the schools, you know, what it is they need to pass the test, and that's it. On the other camp, there are students who take a much more traditional view of higher education. And then in between, I suppose there are the majority who have a whole variety of views. I think all you can do is to try to explain the issues to the students and explain why the sort of agenda that we've been describing actually will damage their education longer term. And if you want a paper that helps you with that, in 2009, I think, Wes Streeting, who was then the president of the NUS, and one of his colleagues, produced a rather good essay for, believe it or not, the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education, which actually made by far the best case I've seen why students shouldn't go down the market kind of route. On the point about freedom of information, I completely agree. It's a scandal. Universities may behave like private corporations, but they are still mostly publicly funded, and I think everybody should resist very, very strongly this attempt to make their affairs covert in that kind of way. So I'm completely with you on that.
But I think the broader point being made there about in the FOI comment was that the TEF is compatible with their business model. I mean, that would be true if it lifted the Cap 1 fees. Then there's no way you could build an alliance with vice chancellors because they'd all love that. But it doesn't. It would actually impose business costs, and this is why there's a possibility of recruiting them. I mean, I take your point entirely about performance management, and it's interesting that the Green Paper asked for responses now. What's the value of the ref to your institution? I think our responses and VC's response is very, very different about that. But one of the things that they said is it helps us in internal decision making. And what does that mean? It means it can be used to manage staff, and that's why they like these kinds of things. But on the other hand, it has to have some money attached to it. You know? And this is the thing that TEF doesn't. It's very important to clarify that point and therefore show how it's not in their interest. But the point about performance management is another way to build links with staff. I mean, do you want another form of performance management, which is exactly what will happen? One point here is that TEF is going to be measured by discipline-specific panels. The TEF score applies to the institution as a whole. Okay, and there's no sense of how those things are going to be aggregated. What that means is if you've got a great chemistry department and a bad French department, there's obviously been a lot of pressure on the French department to either improve or close. So it will breed divisions between people as well. So and that's how internal performance management will be spurred. On the point about students, very briefly, I mean, I think it's very much about what you say to them when they arrive. And I think we just very blinkered in that, just expect students to behave in a certain way, think in a certain way about their education. But they come imbued with other identities and other experiences of education, that it is about spoon-feeding them and making sure they pass exams. And the notion of choice, which is being pushed out by the government. And I think departments have to, as part of the induction process, explain to them the shifting ground of higher education, explain to them what we try to do in universities and how it differs from their past experience and also what the government is suggesting, so that individual academics are then not left fending off these kinds of consumerist demands, because from the very start we've stated a position, which is that this is what a university is, this is the kind of community that you're joining. And so I think it is about us coming together and having that vision